good morning, everybody. I would like to introduce Tammy Jones, the Manitoba Agriculture Weed Specialist, here for this webinar recording we're doing today. We want to talk a bit about the weed problems we have in Manitoba, and I don't know who else would be a better fit for the talk about that than the provincial weed specialist. So I will let Tammy take it over here, and we'll see what we can learn. Take it away, Tammy.
All right, thanks, Soren. So today we will talk about crop rotation for weed management, or how that can be utilized most effectively. And I appreciate the opportunity. Certainly there are some weeds that are increasing in concern, so we'll touch on that. And then some opportunities or some obstacles that we have as far as the management of those. And as you mentioned, I am the weed specialist for Manitoba Agriculture. Been in this role for a couple of years now, and so some of the work that we will be looking at is not my work. I may not be 100% familiar with it, but certainly a good basis for the conversation. So starting off with the 2016 weed survey, which was done just before I entered back into the province, and there were a lot of people that were involved with that: Ag Canada, Manitoba Agriculture, and then lots of the Manitoba commodity groups. And so what the Manitoba Weed Survey did was measure the relative abundance of all the weeds that were found in those particular fields that were surveyed. And so relative abundance is the frequency of that particular weed in the field, how uniform it was across all of the fields, and then the density in all of the fields. And I will show results for Manitoba in general, but I also wanted to take a closer look at what happened in the Southwest, and then cut that compared to, say, Aspen Parkland, just to see if there was a lot of differences in what that weed spectrum looked like. And at the end of the day, when we look at what weeds are the top 10 weeds in Manitoba versus the top 10 weeds in the Southwest area of the province, or within the Aspen Parkland area, of the 658 fields in Manitoba in general, we see the top 10 are fairly similar, regardless of whether you look at the 204 fields in the Southwest or the 274 fields that were surveyed in the Aspen Parkland region. Green foxtail has been the #1 weed for a number of years and continues to be the #1 weed. I don't think that we necessarily look at green foxtail all that much, because it usually isn't an economic impact on our crop yield, but it certainly is present in most fields. Wild buckwheat #2, barnyard grass species, depending on where you looked, it's #3 or #4, wild oats #4 or #3. And then the two that are sort of a bee in my bonnet, I would say, would be the #5 and #9 in Manitoba in general, and that's canola and wheat as weeds. And the reason that those are somewhat upsetting is because those really don't need to be as big of a weed problem if we could manage to put it in the bin instead, or if we had ideal harvest conditions every year. Unfortunately, that doesn't always happen, but there's probably some opportunities to look at our harvest management to help out with reducing those particular ones as weeds. And it took me a little bit of time to find one of the weeds that I associate with southwestern Manitoba, kochia. It was #20 on the list for the Southwest, and at the same time, the #20 weed for Manitoba overall was biennial wormwood, which I also think is a weed that seems to be increasing in most parts of the province. And I think the reason that in 2016 those weeds were lower on the survey would be because it was a wet year, and so we ended up with less kochia being prevalent, just because there was better crop competition and maybe less salt at the top of the soil profile. So the kochia didn't have as much of a competitive advantage as it does in other years. And based on 2018 and 2019, I am seeing that kochia has been very frequent in a lot of fields. So if we look at the top 10 weeds and the changes between 2016 and 2002, the last time the survey was done, there isn't a lot of significant shifts, except for maybe yellow foxtail increasing by 24 ranks. That seems like a pretty significant shift. And yellow foxtail is a C4 plant. It really likes the heat. Maybe we're noticing the difference between yellow foxtail and green foxtail more. And then possibly the other reason that yellow foxtail is increasing in prevalence would be some herbicide resistance in there. If we cut the data a little bit more, we look at 2016 versus all the previous years and the top 10 weeds from 2016. We can see in 2002 that we did have 7 of those weeds in the top 10 as well. So it's been consistent since then. And the ones that have been in the top 10 since 1978, when the weed survey was originally done, would be green foxtail, as I mentioned, wild buckwheat, which never seems to go away, wild oats, which have actually gone down in prevalence in 2016, but have been consistently number 2 in all of the previous years, and red root pigweed. So lots of these weeds that haven't really disappeared. They do seem to have quite an impact on yield in certain years, and maybe we need to think of some different ways to manage those particular weeds. Just as a side note though, I would say that if we look at our average density, so that left column of charts there, we can see that the average density of weeds were tending to go down. So we are doing a good job of weed control, or a relatively good job of weed control. As far as relative abundance goes, broadleaf weeds seem to always be pretty consistent. We maybe see a little bit of a decrease in our annual grass as far as our relative abundance, but we can see that winter annuals and perennials seem to be maybe increasing a little bit. And that could be for a number of different reasons. It could be because of our tillage practices, just a few different scenarios that may contribute to that. And we'll take a look at that a little bit further as we go along. So if we look at the weed shifts based on, I think our main management tool has been herbicide use, we can see that there are certain species that seem to be increasing in rank. Spiny annual sow thistle, definitely within the Aspen Parkland area, is increasing. It's actually in the top 10 in that area. And one of the reasons why herbicide use might not be so effective with sow thistle is that it actually hasn't emerged when we do most of our herbicide applications. So using herbicides to manage that particular weed, probably not that effective. Biennial wormwood going up 25 ranks from 1978. A lot of that is because it is tolerant to most of our herbicides, and so herbicides again aren't going to be that effective. Same thing with roundleaf mallow. We don't have a lot of effective herbicides for it. Cleavers, we're seeing some resistance issues as well as tolerance. Chickweed, again, likes to be in some cooler areas and is shaded by a lot of plants, so maybe our herbicides aren't getting to it. And then wild buckwheat seems to be tolerant to glyphosate, reddens it up a little bit, but otherwise we don't really see that being an effective management tool. And then once it gets in that crop canopy, it seems to be very challenging to control it as well. So those ones, either mainly because of a tolerance or an avoidance of herbicides, seem to be increasing in rank. Some that are decreasing in rank: blue burr, dog mustard, stinkweed, wild mustard, shepherd's purse, and even wild oat. I think it's a lot to do with how our herbicides have been fairly effective on that. Now I'm going to argue with myself on the wild oats maybe a little bit, but we do have a concentrated effort on using herbicides to effectively manage some of those weeds, and we have done a fairly decent job. So I've touched on the term tolerance and touched on resistance. Maybe to just deep dive into that a little bit. Tolerance is the ability of a species to survive and reproduce after herbicide treatment, and it just had that ability from the get-go. So it doesn't mean that there was a selection or genetic manipulation, it just was natural. And another one that comes to mind would be lamb's quarters, where we find that glyphosate isn't necessarily very effective on it at certain times, and that's because of that waxy coating on the leaf surface, or that it flushes a bunch of times. It just seems to be tolerant to glyphosate, for instance. Herbicide resistance, on the other hand, is the inherited ability of a plant to survive and reproduce following a herbicide application that would have previously been lethal. So resistance can be naturally occurring. It can be something that's genetically engineered, as we've done with many crop types, but it's typically through a selection and then development of resistance. And the reason why it sometimes takes us a little bit of time to confirm herbicide resistance is because we do need to grow out that seed and then test it to make sure that it is an inherited trait or heritable trait, and that it wasn't just avoidance or timing or misapplication or something like that. So if we look at the impact of herbicide use, the bars themselves show the number of unique weed biotypes that have developed herbicide resistance. And so back in the 1970s, we didn't have much for herbicide resistance that we were aware of in Manitoba anyway. In the 1980s, we found that there was green foxtail with group 3 resistance, and wild oats were just on the verge of confirming resistance. Oh, and I see that my chart, then the bars have changed a little bit, but so the color coding is off just a little bit, but that should be group 1 and group 3s in the 1980s that we saw. Oh, no, that's not true. Group 2 was wild mustard, sorry. Okay. Then in the 1990s, you can see that there's a number of different biotypes that have herbicide resistance. Now we've confirmed wild oats. We've got wild mustard with group 2 resistance. In fact, we have a number of weeds with group 2 resistance, as well as group 3 resistance in that green foxtail population. We have group 4 resistance and group 5 resistance, which is atrazine, and group 8 resistance, which would be the Avidex type products. By the 2000s, you can see that we have up to 17 biotypes that are resistant. And in the 2010s, so in the decade we're in now, we're well over 20 different biotypes with herbicide resistance in Manitoba. That isn't, if we look worldwide, we're at 500 or so weed biotypes with herbicide resistance. So we are increasing the number of herbicide resistant biotypes as we continue to utilize herbicides. So typically my message is we won't use herbicides to get out of herbicide resistance, and you'll probably see that a little bit later in the presentation. So one of the weeds that very early on and that has some economic importance for us would be wild oats that was confirmed resistant. We have a couple of different types of herbicide resistance in Manitoba. If we look worldwide, wild oats are resistant to 8 different modes of action. And if we look in Manitoba, back in 2002, 44% of fields that had a wild oat in it had some type of herbicide resistance. 40% of those were group 1, 13% were group 2, and 8% were both group 1 and group 2 resistant. And if we're looking at herbicides for resistance management, that seems to be a little bit daunting. Gets a little bit even scarier when you look at 2008 and you see that 60% of the wild oat samples have group 1 or group 2 resistance. And in 2016, there were 151 fields in Manitoba. 101 of those fields had wild oat in them. And when we did the testing then, we're at almost 80% of those fields having some type of herbicide resistance. And now we're at 43% for group 2 resistance. So that's rapidly increased. So if we're thinking that our herbicides are helping to get us out of herbicide resistance, you can see that the trend is that we're just getting more herbicide resistant wild oats, for instance, and I can show you similar trends, and I will show you similar trends with other weeds. But if we look at wild oat control options in wheat based on that, if we've got group 1 and group 2 resistance, and we have a long list of wild oat control options in wheat, we take out some of the group 1s, or all of the group 1s, sorry, then our list gets a little bit smaller. But 40% of those fields still have group 2 resistance, so let's get rid of the group 2s as well. And now we're left with 3 herbicides that are going to be able to help us control or suppress our wild oats, right? So focus is rated as suppression. And if we think about these particular herbicides, the challenge with all of them is that they are pre-plant or pre-seed type of products. So we need to know about our weed problem before we even start planting the crop.
So Tammy,
Yeah.
the question to that, I see you had Avidex on that one of the herbicides that's not a group 1 or 2 to
Right.
combat wild oats. I have a couple of growers who used Avidex or Edge, those types of products back in the day, and they found they had a lot of herbicide hangover, if you can call it that, in years after applying this. Obviously, they were, well, whether you could argue if it was due to lack of proper weather or not enough moisture, whatever, or is there a different way we're applying it now in rotation in what you're hearing being recommended to farmers now, now that it's kind of made a comeback in the industry?
I don't think that it's any easier now. I just think that we need to plan that rotation for both the crop and the herbicide, and that there's going to probably be a little less flexibility within that cropping system as we head into that systems approach. So certainly there are lots of products that have residual effects on the next crop, and we do need to look at that, whether it's a group 8 or a group 14 or a group 15. They all do have crops that they can potentially impact in future years, and they're not alone. There's group 4s, there's group 2s. So having great herbicide records is important in order to ensure that the crop that you're growing the next year isn't impacted. But it's all about planning and maybe just a little less flexibility in the system as far as what crops can be grown, or knowing what those crops are and having 1 or 2 options so that you can substitute effectively. But yeah, there is no easy answer in any of this, and it's going to get more complicated because we do have more resistance out there. So is the herbicide the only option that we can look at? Probably not. It actually is quite challenging. So that's where I think that there are opportunities with crop rotation, tillage, and a bunch of other things to be able to help, and maybe not necessarily need to utilize the soil applied herbicides every year, and just use them as a tool when we need them. Okay, so let's look at kochia, because I think that's one of the favorite weeds in the southwest corner. At least it is when I go home to Napinka.
Favorite would be argued, but
okay,
it's certainly here.
We know it's here. Okay, so if we look at kochia in the herbicide-resistant weeds site of action chart, we can see that there's at least 5 sites of action that kochia is resistant to, and we have at least 4 of those in Manitoba, or in Western Canada, 3 in Manitoba at this point in time. Glyphosate resistance is the one that everyone is most familiar with, and if we look at 2016, the map showed that we had 5 municipalities where we were looking at glyphosate resistance, and if we go back a year or 2 before that, we only had 1 or 2. And in 2018, we're now looking at 2, 4, 6, 8, 11 or so that confirm that they have glyphosate resistance. And to be quite honest, we know that that's underreported, that the map continues to evolve, and the yellow becomes more and more prevalent, that there is glyphosate resistant kochia biotypes in many municipalities.
You're definitely missing 2 municipalities there. Unfortunately, I learned that firsthand.
So the unfortunate part of that is that not everyone wants to report or brag about their herbicide-resistant problems, which I think is a challenge, because it takes the whole community to be able to address some of these herbicide resistance issues. Just because it's on your farm, it's probably on someone else's farm too. And if we don't know about it, it's much harder to manage than if we do know about it. So I do recommend that people report, get it tested, have that knowledge in their back pocket so that they have more awareness of what they're dealing with. But that's another soapbox for another day. So multiple herbicide resistance in kochia in Western Canada. It started in 2012 where we were seeing glyphosate and group 2 resistant kochia in Alberta and in Saskatchewan. We found it in Manitoba in 2014. In 2015, not only did they have group 2 resistance, but they also started to see some group 4 resistance. And so the dicambas and the fluroxypurs were starting to show that there's some ability within kochia to have herbicide resistance development to those as well, which is a little bit surprising, but there it was. And then in Alberta, they're finding dicamba, which is a group 4, glyphosate, group 9, and then the group 2s as well. So 2, 4, and 9 in Alberta. And in the survey that they did in 2017, 10% of the kochia had all 3 sites of action, resistance to all 3 sites of action. So that is, that's a scary story as that continues to increase as well. And it's not just in Manitoba, it's in Kansas, it's in Montana, Nebraska. Oh, and there's my line. We're not going to manage herbicide resistance with herbicides alone. I'm not the only one that says it, but it's something I say fairly often. And so we need to look at other options, and we will in just a minute. But so let's pretend we're going to rely on herbicides alone. Kochia control options in wheat, there are lots of them. This list only goes down to Paradigm, but the list goes longer because they're in alphabetical order. So I took out anything that had only 1 site of action because I was worried that that's going to cause some issues, and that shortened the list. Then I took out anything that was a group 2 alone, or that sort of idea, so that we were making sure that we had multiple modes of effective action for the kochia. You can see that there's a couple in here that are still suppression. Those ones that are in blue, those are our pre-plant or pre-seed type of herbicides again. And so if we're looking for in-crop options, we're very limited. And you can see that 4 and 6 are quite frequently the ones that we're relying on. The group 4s, we know that there is some level of resistance lingering out there already. And if we're talking the group 6, it's a bromoxynil product, and bromoxynil is effective on kochia when it's the size of that picture in the corner. So on the label, bromoxynil is effective in controlling kochia when it's 2 inches or less in height. So timing is everything. And I don't know very many people that spray their kochia when it's that small. And the other confounding effect with that is that kochia likes to germinate in April, May, June, whenever it gets a chance. And so 1 herbicide application is unlikely to control all of your kochia. So that makes it very challenging. If we look at the options in canola, there aren't that many to begin with, and they're either a single site of action or they are something that we already have resistance to, like glyphosate, and then the pre-seed herbicides as well. So that's not a very good picture in canola. And in soybean, we're looking at a lot of pre-seed, some suppression, not very much that's looking at like a good option. In fact, if we're looking for multiple modes of effective action, we have to go to pre-seed herbicides again, and there's heavy reliance on the group 14s and 15s. Okay, the newest one for me that hasn't been detected in the Southwest area would be Amaranthus tuberculatus, or Amaranthus rudis, which is tall water hemp. And on this chart, you can see from June, it's confirmed that it has resistance confirmed to 7 sites of action. They're currently working on confirming 9-way resistance, so 9 different sites of action. So that's an even bigger monster. If we look at tall water hemp in Manitoba, is a tier 1 noxious weed, so destruction is required just from a legal perspective. But the reason for that is because it is such an aggressive weed and it's not native. So if you look at that bottom picture, that is a soybean field with tall water hemp that was ignored for a couple of years. Each water hemp plant can set between 250,000 and 1.2 million seeds. So if you leave it for a couple of years, the population can explode quite quickly. That and its growth rate, it's 50 to 70% faster growing than, say, a red root pigweed, and we already know that it's challenging to keep red root pigweed under control. And then, like I said, that multiple herbicide resistant biotypes, we have it in 4 RMs in Manitoba right now. We can't confirm herbicide resistance, but we definitely suspect group 2 and group 9, some speculation about some group 5 as well. And it is rapidly established along field perimeters, in standing water, and drainage ditches. So in wetter years, we'll start to see some spread of it to some areas that we don't want to. And where we find it currently in Manitoba are those red municipalities, which are in the eastern part of Manitoba. But let's look to our neighbors to the south, and where do they have water hemp confirmation? That red area there, and if you look at that, that takes us all the way to the Saskatchewan border. So if we have a wet year, we have some water movement, and it comes from the south where they already have water hemp that's herbicide resistant, chances are we're going to see it very quickly established in some areas of Manitoba that don't want to see it. So let's go and look at management ideas instead. All right, so the one that we continue to look at first is herbicides. And so back in the day when I was looking at multiple herbicide resistant wild oats, we were still looking at herbicide rotations and rotating between an A or a B, because we knew that if we had just this herbicide A or herbicide B alone, we only have 3 or 4 years before we start to see resistance, and we're aware of it after about 5 years, and then it's out of control by about 6 years. All right, if we're just relying on one herbicide alone to control something. If we rotated between A and B, depending on how we did the rotation, we could find that we could delay herbicide resistance development to 7, maybe 9 years before we started to see a patch in a field. But if we mixed the two, herbicide A and herbicide B, if they're both effective, we could find that it took almost 12 years before we found resistance. And so that's delaying herbicide resistance, but it isn't preventing it, slowing it down. The bad news side of that is that even if we delay it by 12 years before we see herbicide resistance in a population, the last time that we had a new mode of action registered was a couple of decades ago, and it doesn't look like there's a lot new coming down the pipeline. There's a couple of opportunities, but they need to get through development and regulatory assessment and so many things that we're just not sure what options we're going to have in the future. So delaying herbicide resistance is a good option, but I think we need to start looking at other ways that we can reduce weed density or change the weeds that are in our cropping system. So optimizing herbicide use, the things that we thought were going to work, well, we know multiple modes of effective action based on that graph do work. Rotating of herbicides, maybe not the most effective, but maybe rotating our crops is the way that we need to go. And I'm confident that there's some opportunities within that crop rotation rather than herbicide rotation that are going to give us tools to help with herbicide resistance management, but weed management in general. And one of my favorite quotes is this key advice from Dr. Stephen Powles. He's a professor. He's the director of the Australian Herbicide Resistance Initiative. He has been working on herbicide resistance for a long time. And he has said, Dr. Stephen Powles has said, if something is working, change it. So even if you're confident that what you're using for crop rotation and herbicide rotation is working, the weeds are going to adapt to that. And so we need to work at changing it. And another one that I really love for a quote is Neil Harker. And he said, weeds are weeds fortunate enough to grow in a simple repeated cropping system of the same life cycle will continue to have little difficulty adapting and thriving. I think wild oats are a key example, in a wheat canola rotation, where develop a little bit of herbicide resistance and then keep on going. So what can we do if we're not looking at just herbicides? Let's talk crop rotation. And crop type, including variety. So rye, very competitive, seeded in the fall. Sometimes that's a challenge to fit it into a rotation, but it's so competitive, and there is some allelopathy that's noted there as well. So some chemical production that helps in reducing weed competitiveness. So that's an advantage with rye. Oats, barley, wheat, all very competitive as well, as is canola. But we get into peas, soybeans, flax, and lentils, and we're getting a little bit less competitive. And this was Bob Blackshaw and his group back in 2002, when maybe things like corn weren't very prevalent, and so it wasn't assessed. But I would put corn on the less competitive end of the spectrum as well. I always recommend certified seed, simply because you're minimizing any weed seed that's going to be in there. You're also maximizing the vigor of that crop and maximizing your germination. So I always recommend a high quality seed. If you're using something that isn't certified, making sure that you know your vigor and germ so that you can address the potential crop stand issues is important, and then using an effective seed treatment to make sure that you're enhancing that vigor and germ is important as well. Seeding date, let's move that around as much as we can. Seeding rate, I like to increase it as much as possible, just to make sure that I've got a competitive crop. That doesn't work with every crop, right? Corn, if I increase the seeding rate, it starts to compete with itself. And sometimes we run into other management issues that aren't my area of expertise, but certainly disease would be one where seeding rate, there is an upper ceiling. Row width, I prefer, for a weed control side of things, narrower rows for more rapid canopy closure. And this picture shows that quite effectively. Same seeding date, same seeding rate type of thing, but now looking at canopy closure and shading to minimize weed germination. It's much more effective with the left and the narrow rows than it is with the right and wide rows. So with soybeans, for instance, try to look at a narrower row for more rapid canopy closure than a wide row where some of your weeds take advantage of that. Fertilization, sideband and seed placed fertilizer, while there are limits to it, that enhances your crop competitiveness versus a broadcast weed and feed system, which I'm never in favor of. And so I was looking at a study on the long-term effects of crop rotation and fertilizers on the weed community in spring barley. And they said that both crop rotation and combining fertilizers will produce similar effects on the weed community, but that gives us an opportunity to design a more weed suppressive cropping system with less dependence on herbicide use, and that excites me. And another one that we're looking at is cover crops, again, for shading, for competition with some of these aggressive weeds. And that is an increased management issue, because there's all sorts of other things that come along with utilizing cover crops, where it's a green bridge for disease or insects, but lots of management in here, and no easy button. Like herbicide is an easy button. None of these are easy, but I think in the long term, they're going to be a lot more effective. Tillage systems, we do look at tillage as being an opportunity in certain areas to control some weeds. Sometimes that's a good thing. The shift has been to less tillage. And if we look at that, that does mean that we see a shift in some of our weeds. So in a zero-till system, you're going to see more Canada thistle, dandelion, and quackgrass. Although quackgrass is a bit interesting because tillage will spread it, but it can also, favor it in zero-till because it is a perennial. Night flowering catchfly is on both sides with zero-till and conventional till, and that's because you see a shift in the germination patterns depending on when the tillage is introduced. It will germinate after tillage in a conventional tillage system, whereas in a zero-till system, it adjusts as well. So your weeds will adapt to all of your management systems, and you need to be aware of that. But certainly tillage can play a role as far as green foxtail in a zero-till system is almost, less economically important. Conventional till, you'll see more green foxtail, you'll see more lamb's quarters. Red root pigweed loves it, and wild mustard loves it. And that's why maybe wild mustard has seen a downward shift in some of our weed surveys as well. Okay, so tillage system, if you're looking at the management of it, you do need to know your weed species of concern. You need to know when to scout, and you need to consider the herbicide application timing that's going to be most effective. Whether that could be post-harvest, something that's fall applied, or pre-emergent can help you out with some of those scenarios. All right, crop rotation. I'm saying that that's something that we need to look at as far as weed management. We're seeing an increase of warm season crops, so that'd be like your soybeans and your corn at the bottom of the chart. And then we're increasing the acres of row crops, so wider rows where there's slow canopy closure. And again, soybean and corn are primary examples of that, although we have seen wider rows for some of the other production systems as well. If we look at the cut between warm and cool season crops, we can certainly see that there's a cut in which weeds are somewhat more important or somewhat more problematic. Wild oats, they're a C3 type of plant, so they like cool, they like shade, and they do better in similar environments with other C3 plants. So wheat and canola would be your C3 plants. Wild oats, not really a problem in corn most of the time, and not as much of a problem in soybean because those wider row spacings and the heat that gets in between there doesn't necessarily favor wild oat germination, but it does favor red root pigweed and barnyard grasses. And you can see that they tend to creep up a little bit in prevalence in the soybean and corn rotations. So I thought I'd go back to something a little bit dated, but still it's a demonstration of how your crop effect and your tillage can impact on particular weeds. So in this case, I'm looking at winter wheat and a continuous winter wheat scenario over here with downy brome. And you can see that over time, when you're looking at one monoculture, then you can get a rapid increase in a weed that is adapted to that monoculture. So downy brome, a winter annual, which mimics the monoculture of winter wheat. And so certainly very challenging. We're looking at 800 to 1200 plants per meter squared of downy brome in a continuous winter wheat, regardless of whether it was zero-tilled or conventionally tilled. There was still massive increase in the downy brome prevalence. If we look at winter wheat and fallow, look at the scale. We're now looking at a plant density of 0 to 120 plants per meter squared. And if we went winter wheat canola, again, there was a little spike in the prevalence of the downy brome, but we're still looking at only 80 to 100 plants per meter squared versus this 800 to 1200. So the crop, if you're looking at a monoculture, if we look to the US with corn, we've seen water hemp, Palmer amaranth become quite problematic in corn and soybean because that crop rotation enhances the competitive ability of those particular weeds, just like this winter wheat continuous cropping system enhance the competitive ability of downy brome. So change it up. Certainly from my perspective, with what we're looking at for weed issues, we're looking at increased calls about water hemp, biennial wormwood, and some nightshade species. I'm also seeing Canada fleabane, a little bit of giant ragweed, and then hairy Galensaga is another one that I've seen a little bit more of. Part of that is probably because of the way that some of them emerge. So biennial wormwood, for instance, look when it starts to germinate. Not until June, usually. Water hemp, same kind of idea. It'll start emerging earlier, but its peak emergence is later after most of our spray applications have happened. And that's why those are very challenging to deal with from a herbicide perspective. And that's where crop canopy and shading and all those things will certainly help us to mitigate that. So if I'm looking at rotating crops, I'm thinking of a few different things. Winter cereals like fall rye and winter wheat, because your seeding dates change. A long season broadleaf like maybe a sunflower, flax, soybean, even a chickpea in certain areas, although I don't think Manitoba is necessarily the area. Spring cereals like wheat, oat, barley, and corn, even though it can be a little bit longer season. There are some more rapidly maturing varieties that do have a fit within a lot of areas of Manitoba, and then a short season broadleaf like canola, pea, or lentil, and rotating through those to change things up. So we're looking at C3s at certain times, C4s at other times, different herbicides in all of them. Some like tillage, some don't, and just going for diversity. There is going to be that volunteer crop that you're going to have to manage, and most crop volunteers germinate the year after harvest. So you can see that depending on your crop rotation, you're going to have something that's going to be needing to be managed. But in a canola crop, wheat is relatively easy to manage. In corn, canola can be relatively easy as long as they're not the same herbicide resistance trait. The same thing with canola in wheat and soybean. The wheat can be out of there as well. The one that is truly probably the most challenging out of this would be soybean and canola. And there you need to look at some different herbicide mixtures to try and help with that. Or again, maybe using an integrated approach. And for that, limit your harvest losses, like I implied earlier. Encourage germination. And the way to do that is maybe fall tillage. And then again, an effective herbicide program. So by doing a little bit of fall tillage, we can stimulate germination, especially if we do it in the early fall and we have some nice moisture. We don't get that every fall, but if we look at early fall tillage, we can get about 40% of that canola to germinate then, because it doesn't have any seed dormancy, and that can minimize what we have for canola volunteers the next year. Okay, so crop effects, rotating our crops. What am I suggesting? A mix of grass and broadleaf crops. They certainly utilize sunshine different. They utilize their rooting systems are different. Everything about them is a bit different, and so that diversity helps in competing with weeds, because different weeds flourish in different scenarios. Also looking at cool season versus warm season crops, mixing that up. Certainly in a corn and soybean rotation, we see water hemp coming to the forefront in some of our areas in Manitoba already, whereas in the cool season rotations of wheat and canola, we see something like wild oats taking a bigger part of our herbicide program. So mixing it up by putting a warm season crop in with your cool season ones is going to help, because you're going to change a bunch of different things, including which herbicides you can use, but also what tillage system you're using, also when it's most competitive. And then perennials versus annuals. There's still a role for perennials in certain situations when you have weed control issues, because you're preventing weed set when you're harvesting perennials such as an alfalfa for hay. Silage is another way of doing that with an annual crop, because you go in and do an early harvest date. So if we can change up both the seeding and the harvesting dates, then we can start to minimize seed set, reduce the seed bank in that field, and help out in a bunch of different ways. Now, granted, there is Mother Nature. That's the wild card effect. We've seen changes in some weeds just because of that. So broadleaf plantain in 2016, really high up on the weed survey. It was a wetter year, and broadleaf plantain seems to do much better in that. Russian thistle decreased in that year, but yet yellow foxtail increased. And again, I think there's some other contributors to yellow foxtail, and then the barnyard grasses. I think there's herbicide resistance that's been undetected that is contributing to their increase rather than Mother Nature necessarily. So for Mother Nature, your management program is probably scouting. And if we take all of that and wrap it up, rotate your crops, I think is the biggest opportunity. We're already mixing up our herbicides with their modes of action. We're already looking at application timing, whether we look at pre-seed or fall applied, and residuals versus non-residuals. We're already fully maximizing that opportunity, I think. And so we need to look at crop rotation and scouting to help enhance that. And so with that, Soren, I'm going to stop because I think I'm well over time, and challenge people to ask some questions and maybe challenge me on some of the ideas that I'm presenting here.
Well, thank you, Tammy. This was a really good kind of, can we call it an introduction to what we want to follow up with? We definitely want to dig into this a little bit deeper. This is one of 3 videos we want to record here this fall to try and take a long-term approach. And a lot of our growers know I have been trying to advocate for 4-year crop rotation on farm since the day I started selling seed, and it's been very difficult. We've had weather challenges, market challenges, you name it. There's been all kinds of issues, but it seems like it doesn't matter what we talk about. Are we talking about weed resistance issues? Are we talking about crop disease issues? Even grain market volatility? To me, it seems like we need to change what we're doing to be profitable long term on farm. And I think we need to take advantage of some of the people that essentially farmers are paying for our government people to do all this research. We need to listen to it because we can learn from it. And we want to use these videos to kind of lead up to a meeting later this fall where we would like to invite all of you growers out to meet with Tammy and dig into this a little bit deeper. We can dig into specific weed issues deeper, you name it, basically whatever questions we may have. And I know, Tammy, you said you had roughly twice as many slides that you could go on about for this presentation. So I think you have a lot more to bring to us as well.
I could go on forever, and I'm looking forward to the opportunity, Soren.
That's excellent. So thanks for now. And if there is any questions in the meantime, I'm sure Tammy would be happy to answer them if anybody reaches out. And if not before then, we will see everybody at the meeting later this fall. Thanks, Tammy.
Great, thanks.